Son of Man was loved by the man in black. Let's talk about Johnny Cash with Richard Beck on Steve Brown, etc.
He's an old white guy, an author, broadcaster, and seminary professor who's sick of religion. And he's brought friends. Please welcome Steve Brown, etc.
And we are so glad you're here. You always have a place at our table. I'm Steve, the aforementioned old white guy. Our favorite mega church pastor, Zach Van Dyke, is here. He's known as the man in khaki.
We're going to do this today.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Matthew Matthew Porter's here with us. Matthew was doing good on his New Year's resolutions. And then he tripped over the cat, and everything went south.
Sorry. Broke a couple there.
Did you hurt the cat?
No. Just myself.
Did you hurt your family with the language that you used?
No.
He's got 4 chances to trip. They've got 4 cats.
It's a lot of cats. Yes.
Our producer, Jinx, is working hard in the little glass booth. Jinx has seen a million faces, and he's mic'd them all. Our video director, John Myers, is in the tech bunker. And once again, John was passed over for an Oscar nomination. I'm so sorry, John. And then Jeremy Birdsall is here. He is an incredible musician. He's also now a seminary student. Good night. Hey, Jeremy.
Sorry, man.
Don't hold that against me.
Watch out for that Hebrew and Greek class.
Give us a big new word that you've learned.
My current word of the day is tritheism.
Tritheism.
You got that from John Frame, did you?
Oh, look at this! Look at this guy. I bet you went to seminary too.
Tritheism. That means.
Wait.
No.
Let's see if Zach knows.
I was worried you were going to ask that. It took me 7 years to get through seminary, and I wasn't really paying attention. So,
Tritheism is a doctrine that says, look, even if you're just trying, that helps.
Yeah.
That works for me.
Part of the self-esteem movement. Yeah.
And Kathy Wyatt is the soft feminine side of the program. Kathy runs things around Key Life, so if something's wrong, if we offend you, if we make bad mistakes, take it up with her, okay? And our guest.
How did I get that?
Listen, I don't write this stuff.
I know you don't.
Read it, okay?
I know.
Listen, I've been outsourcing it to China for a couple months now, so don't
Is it
blame
lost
me.
in translation?
Don't blame
Is that
me.
what's happening?
Look, times are tough.
Listen, our guest today is Richard Beck. He's a popular blogger, speaker. He's a professor of psychology at Abilene Christian University. His published research covers topics as diverse as psychology of profanity. Man, we got to do another program.
Wow, yeah,
on
I
that.
want to know about that.
And why Christian bookstore art is so bad.
No, I really want to know about
I like
that.
that.
And I just want you to know, Richard, that's not going to help you sell books. That was not a good thing to write about if you're trying to sell books. Just a word of wisdom from the old guy. Richard has authored several books, and his latest, which I hold in my nicotine-stained fingers, is Trains, Jesus, and Murder, the Gospel According to Johnny Cash. Richard, it's good to have you with us.
Oh, it's good to be with you all, although that intro scared me to be joining this group of people.
Yeah,
I'm a little intimidated.
You should be scared.
Oh, yeah.
Sure you are. Hey, I don't know if you, and Richard, I don't know if you can see it or the people who are watching the video stream, but right behind me is a poster, a Johnny Cash poster, will give you an idea of the altar at which we worship. No, we really don't, but I really like Johnny Cash, and that poster was given a number of years ago by our daughter and son-in-law to me because they knew my feelings about Johnny Cash. And so needless to say, when I started your book, I didn't know what to expect. You read a Christian writing about somebody I like, and I don't want them to mess it up. Richard, this book, and guys, you have got to get this book. You're going to love it. It's not only informative and fun, it's profound. And it says things about Johnny Cash that haven't been said in very many venues. So, Richard, thank you for writing this book. Start at the start. You teach a Bible study at a prison, and you were listening to the radio. You didn't know much about Johnny Cash, did you?
Yeah, I teach a Bible study every Monday night at a maximum security prison north of my hometown here in Abilene, and I know a little bit about Johnny Cash. Didn't count myself a huge fan, but picked up his iconic Live at Folsom Prison concert just because I wanted to listen to the album as I drove back and forth to the prison. And anybody who's ever listened to that album knows it is unforgettable.
It is.
And it's the sounds of the room, the cheering, the inmates, the guards breaking in, the surface tension with the warden. It was a world I recognized, and that was kind of my hook. That's kind of what captured my imagination. I after that just couldn't get enough Johnny Cash.
Yeah, it gets that way after a while. I took my wife, by the way, who is a classical musician, Jeremy, and she
Did not know that.
And she's not a big Johnny Cash fan. And I was speaking for this convention for Youth for Christ staff people, and Johnny Cash brought 2 or 3 semis, his entire show, and put it on for fun, for free, to say thank you to these guys and what they were doing with young people. And as you mentioned, he always opens his concerts with "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash." And after he says that, one of the reasons Johnny Cash had trouble holding a tune sometimes, and but nobody knew it because everybody's shouting. And so he said, "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash," and the place went crazy. And before the evening was over, my sweet little wonderful feminine wife was standing on the table up next to the stage, and whistling. I'll tell you, I think I made a mistake in this marriage. But Johnny Cash has a tendency, not just because of his music, but because of who he is and the reality and the childlike authenticity of who he is, which you talk about so often and so well in this book. What's your favorite thing to say about Johnny Cash?
Oh, that's huge. I think I have one of my favorite moments. One really speaks to me, and I think it's kind of one of the best parts of the book. The story is that if you look at the album At San Quentin, the kind of live follow-up album that Cash recorded, the song San Quentin is recorded back to back, which is strange for an album that you would sing a song twice in a row. Uh-huh. But if you know the story about why that happened, San Quentin is probably not one of his most popular songs, but it is just a harsh indictment of the prison industrial complex. And he started that song by saying, like, I don't know what it feels like to be in prison, but I've tried to put myself in your shoes. And if I was in your shoes, this is how I'd feel about San Quentin. And it's just a venomous kind of song. And it so spoke to the inmates that they just screamed and demanded he sing it again. And he sang it twice in a row. And after he sang it the second time, the room filled up with like so much energy, it just bordered almost on a riot. And Cash told his producer later on, he says, I felt like if I had said, "Let's go," a prison riot would have broke out right at that moment. And he confesses to being a little tempted in doing that. So I just love that moment where he was so able to speak into the plight and the feelings of the incarcerated that he just channeled that energy. And I think he could do that with audiences. He could speak for them in ways no other artist could do.
That was a supernatural thing, wasn't it?
No, I think so. And it's hard. I appreciate what you said about the book, because for a lot of people, I've discovered that Johnny Cash is kind of holy ground. He means a great deal to a lot of people. And so when you're trying to write about somebody so formative and iconic, you can get it wrong. You can get crosswise with people. And so I appreciate what you said, because I do think in many ways he has been the spiritual muse for so many seekers.
Oh, he really has. And one of the things that is so good, we have this, and I'm an evangelical. I'm a Bible thumper. I believe the Bible and all that. I just want to say that before you send me the letters. But our witness to the world is we're good, they're bad. If you come to Jesus, you'll be good like me. And Johnny Cash, and we're going to talk about this with Richard on the other side of the break. Johnny Cash ran to Jesus over and over and over again. And then he went back into the far country and slept with the pigs. And everybody listening to my voice who's honest knows what that means. You don't stay on the farm, but you don't stay with the pigs as long as you did before. At any rate, don't you go anywhere. This is going to be a wonderful hour with Richard Beck. Hello, I'm Steve Brown.
Wait, we were supposed to cheer.
Almost as low.
That's pretty good.
We're interviewing Richard Beck, and he's great. He's fun to be with, and this book you've got to get. It's Strange, Jesus, and Murder, the Gospel According to Johnny Cash.
Richard, I know that I don't know a lot of details, obviously, but I know that Johnny Cash had a really very tragic and difficult life. But there was, in looking over your book earlier this morning and also in the show prep, there was made mention the fact that there was a pretty significant defining moment that involved his brother. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, his older brother, Jack, was kind of his best friend. Jack, I think, was around 15 years old and was kind of planning on being a minister. And he died in a horrific saw accident. He was cutting fence posts at the school shop and was pulled into a saw that cut into his abdomen and through his intestines. And he lingered for a few days and kind of died tragically. And it wasn't just a catastrophic loss in Cash's own personal life that Jack was kind of his best friend, but his father kind of blamed him for Jack's death. He felt probably that Johnny should have had Jack with him that morning. They were going to go fishing. And so not just the trauma of the loss, but kind of the internalized guilt that his father placed upon him. He kind of felt his whole life that he was responsible for his brother's death. And I think a lot of the interesting contrast in Cash's music and life, kind of that interesting blend of kind of darkness and grace, light and dark, his own troubles with addiction later on. I think a lot of that trauma goes back to the loss he experienced with his brother Jack.
Do you tell the story about the time he was on the airplane and they hit an air pocket and where he found himself?
Yeah, and he wrote two different autobiographies. This one was the first one he wrote in the 70s, kind of after he'd come out of a season of addiction and kind of was now kind of an evangelical spokesperson. But he writes at the end of the book, flying over their home state in Arkansas, and the plane hit a bit of turbulence, shook everything in the plane, and he looked out the window and realized at that exact moment where they hit that turbulence, they had just flown over the cemetery where Jack was buried. And he took that as kind of a divine sign that Jack was still with them. And he had made a promise. This is the other thing about Cash. He wanted to initially be a gospel music singer. And when he went to Sun Studios in Memphis, that's what he auditioned with, was gospel music. And he wanted to be a gospel music singer because of Jack. Jack, again, was going to go in the ministry, and Cash was trying to figure out a way he can honor his brother's legacy. And he made a promise to Jack that he would sing gospel music through his entire life. And so after he kind of gets that bit of turbulence in the book, he writes that he had kept his promise to Jack. He was still singing those gospel hymns that they grew up listening to their mother play. And he continued to do that all the way to the end of his career, sang gospel music as kind of a witness for Jack and preaching that message.
Wow.
Jeremy?
It's powerful. I know there's far more educated folks here than I, but to be the nerdy seminary student guy, I do say I was hit by sort of the intro chapter and talking about I walk the line, and that the chesed is God singing I walk the line to us. And I just thought that was tremendously powerful. I like how you referenced too later on that Johnny wrote that song, but he never really walked the line, really. But I always thought that was a pretty profound way of looking at it, that God is walking the line for us. And you go in and you talk about the covenants and dividing the animals and God walking between them. And like I said, I hate to be that nerdy guy, but that really, I thought, was profound.
That's not nerdy. That is profound. You want to comment on that, Richard?
Well, yeah, I mean, so I Walk the Line was written early in his career. He was married to his first wife, Vivian, at the time, and he was out on the road touring with people like Elvis. And so she's watching how the young women are reacting to Elvis and her husband. She's getting a little worried about his keeping his marital vows. So he sings this kind of ode to fidelity, I'll walk the line for her. But late in his life, he also described to the biographer Robert Hilburn that the song had two meanings to it. He thought it was his first gospel song. That the pledge, I walk the line, was also an ode to fidelity to God. But as you pointed out, he didn't keep all of those promises. He and Vivian eventually divorced. He had his own season of struggles and darkness, and so his promises to God he did not keep. But I think his life story is that even though when he wandered, as you referenced, Steve, to the far country, God never left him, and he kind of kept preaching that message throughout his life. How at one point when he was really suicidal and wandered off into a cave system north of Chattanooga, and he just wanted to wander back in the cave. This was at the height of his addiction. His divorce with Vivian had finalized. He just wanted to wander off in this cave and die. And he laid down in the darkness, and God spoke to him in an audible voice, saying, "I'm still here." And to me, that's hesed in Johnny Cash's life. God's still there. God's fidelity, God's faithfulness, that we might wander off, but God doesn't break God's promises. And so Cash's life, I think people identify with him because of the brokenness he displayed in his life and his music. But I think the gospel message in his life, not just in his music, but in his own personal spiritual autobiography, was God's fidelity to him.
And by the way, if you're not familiar with Johnny Cash, don't get the idea of some kind of television evangelist who appears to be everything together, but is in secret, doing some really bad stuff. Johnny Cash was authentic. I mean, he didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. He clung to Jesus because that was all he had. And he knew it, and he knew if grace wasn't true, then he didn't have a chance of a snowball in a hot place.
Steve and I were talking about this morning, and I was just mentioning how I kind of like my heroes damaged, and not that they like them damaged. We're all damaged. There's something reassuring in a weird kind of way of when you can see the struggles and see the vices up front, and you're like, okay, that's your thing, versus somebody who's just kind of high on a pillar, and they're flawed and sinful, and you're like, you seem like a good guy, but I feel like one day we're gonna find out you like drowning kittens for fun, and and it's gonna be a little bit of a letdown. But there is that kind of power, like you talk about a lot, Steve, with identification of like, look, I've never been to prison, me, Johnny Cash, but I can identify with a lot of what you're going through. And Richard, I think that's kind of part of his enduring legacy and appeal.
Hold it.
Definitely. I mean, I think that's what
Richard, hold it. We're gonna back out. This is called a teaser in the industry. Don't put a finger in the sentence you just started, because we're gonna come back and I want you to respond to what Matthew said. You know, we didn't make up that stuff about everybody being flawed. The good people in the church and the bad people are at the bar. The truth is, we got that from Jesus himself, clearly taught in Scripture. So if you're playing the wrong game, just stop it, because you're really messing up the real story of what this thing is about. Listening to Steve Brown, etc., and we're talking with Richard Beck about a wonderful book, Strange Jesus and Murder, The Gospel According to Johnny Cash. And sometimes I say this would be a great study for a small group in your church, but this is just a wonderful book you've got to read. You might want to do that, but this is a book that once you start, you can't put down, and I recommend it highly.
Looking at Johnny's life, it's so funny. If you have a life full of contradictions, that's one thing, but if you have a life full of contradictions and you're successful, you graduate to being complicated. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. And he's certainly a complicated character. Right before the break, we were talking about how that's kind of his appeal, where you could see what the flaws were, and he clearly loved God and wrestled with demons. It's in so many words, it's not surprising that he and Bono eventually kind of connected and collaborated. Do you think that's a large part of his enduring appeal, Richard?
Oh, no doubt. I mean, that's kind of where the title came from. I was during this season where I was just listening to Johnny Cash and kind of an addictive kind of way. My sons are just soaking it up every time they drive with me in the car. And that's where the title of the book came from. My son Aiden said to me on the way to school one day, he goes, Dad, Johnny Cash sings about three things: trains, Jesus, and murder. And I said, son, that'd be a great title of a book. And it stuck. But I think it's that contrast, his ability to speak to the dark side that we can identify with in our brokenness, but that it wasn't just dark. He just doesn't leave us in a dark place. That there was a redemptive arc to his music and his own story as well. And so I think that's the appeal to Johnny Cash. You can listen to a lot of Christian music exclusively, and you can listen to kind of a lot of, I guess, secular music that goes to dark places. But Cash was able to hold the light in the dark. He would sing a murder ballad, but then he would sing Amazing Grace in the same, concert in the same album. And I think that speaks to all of us, because I think we sense those tensions in our own hearts. And I think that's why he was so popular with prison audiences. They listened to his music and they said, this guy gets me. He never was in prison himself. Some people mistakenly think he was jailed. He went to jail a couple of times.
Yeah, but not prison. But he was able to speak to their alienation and loneliness and marginalization that they would write to him, and that's why he just would give all of these free concerts for inmates.
I didn't know who Johnny Cash was until I was in college and I was watching the MTV Video Music Awards, and Justin Timberlake won Best Male Video for Cry Me a River, and he got up there and he said, "This is a travesty." Johnny Cash was nominated too for his cover of Nine Inch Nails' song "Hurt," and I remember after he said that I was like, "Huh." And so I went back and watched the music video of "Hurt," and just blown away. Like, I didn't even know. And I think there are probably a lot of people in my age that did not know about him until that moment. And so I was wondering, like, as he kind of ended his life, and that song was so, I mean, I still listen to that song. What kind of was defined kind of the end of his life? Like, how did he kind of finish things?
Well, his career kind of peaked in the 70s. He even had a TV show, the Johnny Cash Show, and that probably kind of signals the end of your cultural relevance when you kind of have a variety show.
Right.
Sonny and Cher. Yeah.
I can't see him doing that.
You weren't even born.
Pretty cheesy. It's pretty cheesy.
This show is morose.
Right.
Yeah.
And so in his history, the 80s is considered his lost decade. He was still putting out albums, but most of them weren't very memorable. And then he was actually even dropped by Columbia Records during the 80s in a big embarrassment and shock to the Nashville music establishment. But then in the early 90s, he bumped into Rick Rubin, who was a producer of, metal bands and rap and hip hop. And Rubin was looking for a challenge. I mean, Cash seemed past his career, and it was a really unlikely partnership. This kind of hippie producer of rap and metal bands working with an aged country music icon. But they produced 4 albums before Cash's death, the American Recordings albums, that a lot of people consider to be some of the most significant music that he ever produced. And it's those albums in the 90s that really captured the attention of a younger audience, that kind of MTV audience. And Hurt probably is the most iconic song from that season. So Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails wrote Hurt in the midst of his own heroin addiction. And Rubin had Cash sing it. And there's just a lot of pain and regret and suffering in Hurt that, comes from the story of a 20-year-old Trent Reznor. But when it's sung by an aged Johnny Cash, looking back over his whole life, there's a haunting line in there that says, "Everyone I know goes away in the end." And when that's sung by an older man, and like Steve, you had already mentioned, June had passed on at that point too. There is just a sadness and a pathos and a depth to that song that many people consider it one of the greatest covers in rock music history.
And I just have to say quickly as we're going to the break, if you seek out that song, you've got to see the video.
Yeah, you can't.
If there was only one music video, that's it for me. It is astonishing.
It'll blow you away. And guys, you're saying, he sounded like a pagan to me. No, he wasn't. I said at the beginning that the Son of Man was loved by the man in black, but the Son of Man loved the man in black. And we're going to talk about how that happened on the other side of the break. So don't go anywhere. If you turn off your radio or your computer before you hear more of this, you will get the hives. If anybody asks you, tell them you're listening to Steve Brown, etc. Listen, if you really like this time with Richard Beck, let me give you a website, experimentaltheology.blogspot.com. Experimental theology, which means that he teaches Buddhism and Islam.
And tritheism.
Tritheism. Thank you, callback.
Right.
Yes.
Experimentaltheology.blogspot.com, and you'll be glad.
Hey, I just wanted to have a quick follow-up piece on what we were talking about early about the Rick Rubin era and the American sessions. I think it is so interesting to listen to how it was recorded. And, I produce music as well, and so microphones is kind of a thing I like. But I was just thinking about this earlier that you listen to early recordings with Johnny Cash and especially other country artists. They could take one microphone and record a whole group in a room, and when you get to the end of Cash's time recording with Rick Rubin, it sounds like you're laying your head on his chest and he's just kind of singing you a lullaby, and it's this really close, big, warm sound, and I think that contributes a lot to the power and the intimacy of these records. And just wanted to get your kind of thoughts on that too, on that era.
Yeah, I think that was part of the genius of Rubin, where he, in a lot of this music that he recorded with Cash, got the heavy production out of the way and just let Cash's voice come through. And even as those albums go on later on, his voice gets increasingly weak as well. Mm-hmm. In fact, in some of the final recordings, he could barely get the lyrics out, and they had to splice the songs together bit by bit. As he had to take breaths in between. But that's what's so haunting about it, is the degree of intimacy. His voice itself, even when it's weak and frail, is so close to you that, you feel like you're sitting in the room with him. And there's just nothing really quite like it.
Yeah, it's powerful.
Talk about the landing of the plane. I mean, he really believed all this stuff about Jesus. And he landed the plane well, didn't he? Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, I think he grew up obviously Baptist, but in his early career kind of lost touch with his faith, and I think that's where he got a little wayward. I think he drifted very far away from God during the 50s and early 60s in the height of his drug addiction. And as Robert Hilburn accounts in his biography, that his sobriety was still tenuous. He went back into rehab a couple different times after that season. But he did recover his faith in the late 60s and became a really overt evangelist for the Lord. I don't know if people know this, but he actually wrote a book about the Apostle Paul called The Man in White. Yeah. And you can buy that on Amazon right now. So he spent many years just digging into the history of Israel. He visited Israel multiple times, fell in love with the country, and recorded a whole album called The Holy Land, where he recorded kind of native sounds of the birds and he went to Cana and recorded there where they believe the miracle of turning the water into wine happened. And eventually, I don't know if people know this as well, he eventually filmed on his own dime and produced it and wrote it and acted in it, a feature-length movie called The Gospel Road. And it's just, I think it's on Netflix. You can watch Johnny Cash kind of narrate the life of Jesus in word and song. And it's probably the most overt you'll see him. I mean, you literally see him standing on a mountain in Israel with the King James Version of the Bible in his hand, telling the message of Jesus. And so he at times became an overt evangelist for the gospel that saved him. And he was speaking not just abstractly. This was the God that pulled him out of hell and back into the light.
And throughout his whole career, he was clear about what the gospel was, what the main thing was. That never changed, did it?
No, and I think that's another compelling thing about thinking about Cash from a theological perspective, is that theme of grace is just highlighted all the way throughout his whole life, because we've been talking about the brokenness and his own struggles, but that darkness in his life and in our own just provides the contrast for what the gospel really is, which is God's undeserved favor for all of us. That is our only hope, right? That God walks the line for us. Because if it's up to me to walk the line, if God and I enter into a partnership where I have to hold up my side of the bargain, I think we all know that's a doomed proposition. And Cash, I think his whole story just illustrates that.
Talk about the Christofferson song. And we don't have a lot of time, but that was pretty central to the book. You even referenced it in your acknowledgments. Chris Christofferson song that he wanted Cash to record, and eventually he did. Talk about that a little bit.
Sunday Morning Coming Down. Christofferson wrote it about his own, again, experience of substance abuse. And he really wanted Cash to cover it. And Cash was a little bit resistant at first. So the stories vary on how forceful he got with Cash. One account even has him landing in a helicopter in his backyard, says, "You got to sing this song."
Little rock
but
stars.
Cash,
Exactly.
yeah. Cash just eventually listened to the song and realized at one point, he said, I could identify with every lyric. And it's a song about a guy who wakes up with a hangover on a Sunday morning, and he's wandering through the neighborhood, and he hears the sounds of a church singing hymns, and he sees a father pushing his daughter in a swing, and he walks by and smells Sunday morning fried chicken from a family, and just experiences the alienation, how disconnected he is from faith and from family and from hope. And so Sunday morning comes crashing down on him. And Cash covered this song, and it's now kind of one of the most beloved Cash covers that he ever did. But again, it's him giving voice to an alienation that many people do. I spoke at a church where I played some of this music and talked about it. And I was walking out of the church, and the guy said to me, an older guy in his 80s, he goes, "Listen, that song, that was me. That was me. I was a drunk, and I was, on the street, dirty and homeless. And that song is the gospel to me because Cash saw me where I was in my life." And so, yeah, you realize when you talk about Johnny Cash with people, how different songs through his career, and Sunday Morning Coming Down is one of them, that they are just, they've been lifelines for people.
Mm.
They feel seen in a way that they've never been seen by an artist before. And I think that's his great legacy, that Cash was able to see us in his music, and by seeing us, get the experience of God seeing us. I think that Cash was once asked if he could summarize his music in one word, what would he say? And he said, love. And I think that's the message of the gospel.
It really is. Richard, we just started this, and now we got to end it, and I just hate it. You obviously do this quite well. So when you do something quite well, you got to do it again. So we will expect that. We want to talk about the psychology of cussing.
I could do a whole hour on that.
I know. Listen, we're going to have you on again. I hope you'll say yes when Kathy calls. Richard, God bless you, and thank you for spending this time with us and writing the book. The book is Strange Jesus and Murder, the Gospel According to Johnny Cash. Buy it, read it, give it to all your pagan friends. Best witness you will ever make. Don't go away. We're coming back. Really was a fun hour, and Kathy's right. I do owe her.
Big time.
That was a great hour. I absolutely loved it, and I knew I was going to like it. When I read the book, I thought, this is going to be fun, and we're going to have trouble getting this in an hour, and we didn't. I mean, we could have gone.
Did we even talk about murder?
We didn't even get
We can get to the last word.
Oh, he's
we got
got a
trains
song.
in Jesus.
Oh, yeah, we could. There's just so many places we could go, but bottom line is this is what this thing is all about. And there's a sense in which Johnny Cash is not only a person, he's a metaphor. And he's not only that, he is a representative of what the pure gospel is all about. And it's about flawed people being loved by a God that a lot of people lie about. A God who reaches out and loves us before we love him, because that was the only way it could work. And boy, you get somebody like Johnny Cash. I don't want to go the places he went. In fact, I probably could. And there have been some of them, but I'm not going to talk about it because I need the job. But I'm glad he did. And I'm glad he was as bad as he was, because you can see the pristine nature of God's pure love in the face of our sin. So if you're not a believer and you're listening to this program, First, are you crazy? Secondly, we're glad you're here. And thirdly, you heard what the gospel is about today. It's about, and Luther put it well, we're great sinners and we have a great Savior. And anybody tell you different, they don't know what they're talking about or they're lying outright. Okay? How are you going to top this next week?
Well,
Johnny Cash is coming.
Johnny Cash.
We're going to have a seance and have Johnny Cash.
actually, we're not going to top it next week because we did some changing around of things, and so I can't exactly tell you what's going to happen next week. So
we could top it.
Have to
we
find
could top
out.
it. It could. We might.
Well,
maybe.
yeah, we could.
Maybe.
But what we're going to have to do is just rely on the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who listen to the program to join because of our stellar reputation.
Oh, man, that's pretty scary. Hey, guys, you join them next week. I'm not going to be here. I'm going to back out.
Oh, no, you're going to be here.
And join us. Between now and then, don't do anything we wouldn't. And that gives you a wide, wide berth.